Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. You guys good? Okay. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Marisa Rigi, and I'm the Executive Director of Western New York Land Conservancy. For those who may be new to our work, the Land Conservancy is a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the forests, farms, wetlands, and wildlife habitats that make Western New York such a special place to live. We acknowledge that the Land Conservancy works on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Seneca, Tonawanda Seneca, Tuscarora, and other indigenous communities. And we are grateful to the Haudenosaunee for their enduring stewardship. We commit to learning from the past and acting responsibly for future generations as part of our work towards justice and care for the land. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome Leigh Ann Henion, author of the remarkable book, Night Magic: Adventures Among Glowworms, Moon Gardens, and Other Marvels of the Dark. As I prepared for this evening, I found myself reflecting on a recent wildlife camera study conducted by the Land Conservancy. Looking through thousands of photographs, one thing became immediately clear. While most of us are sleeping, Western New York is wide awake. Under the cover of darkness, foxes move through fields, elusive bobcats travel forest corridors, owls silently hunt, and countless other creatures go about their lives, largely unseen by humans. An entire world emerges when the sun goes down. And increasingly, that world depends on darkness. Research has shown that many mammals around the globe are becoming more nocturnal as they adapt to trends in human activities. As our communities expand, wildlife is not only being pushed into smaller spaces, it's being pushed into different hours of the day or night. Darkness, it turns out, is a natural resource, yet it's one we rarely think about protecting. It should be no surprise that most of the wildlife cores and corridors of the Western New York Wildway lie in areas where darkness allows animals to move according to their needs. We often associate light with comfort and safety, but excessive artificial light can disrupt ecosystems, alter animal behavior, affect plant life, and even impact human health. The loss of darkness means the loss of something essential, not emptiness, but a living, interconnected part of our natural world. Tonight, Leigh Ann invites us to see darkness differently, not as something to fear, but as something to appreciate, experience, and protect. From glowworms and moonlit gardens to moths, bats, and star-filled skies, the night is full of wonder if we take the time to notice it. And perhaps many of us know that feeling already, the sense of awe that comes from standing beneath a sky full of stars and recognizing that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. That experience, like so much of the natural world, depends on darkness. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to Leigh Ann Henion.
Hi, thanks so much for coming out. I'm so happy to be here. So my book, Night Magic, was inspired by a magazine story that I wrote for the Washington Post magazine about synchronous fireflies. So are you guys familiar with synchronous fireflies? Yeah? Okay, have any of you seen them? So those of you that might not be familiar, so in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, this is the most famous place to see synchronous fireflies. They have an event every year. Tens of thousands of people apply to a lottery to be able to see these fireflies. So I had an editor at the Washington Post, and during the pandemic, they did a travel issue, and it was travel writers not traveling. Then the next issue was travel writers traveling close to home. And so when he came to me, he said, "Leigh Ann, what have you always wanted to see close to home in your own home region?" And I was like, I want to see the synchronous fireflies. And so amazingly, I was able to go see the synchronous fireflies in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And I thought that synchronous meant that they went on, off, but that's not what happens. They do synchronize their flashes, but they do that by communicating to the firefly next to them. So what it actually looks like is a twinkling along the forest floor, and then all of a sudden there's a whoosh of light. And then a twinkling, and a whoosh of light. And so it's really like watching the northern lights travel across the sky, but it's this living light along the forest floor. And it was beautiful. It was fantastic. But what I realized was that was a fantastic experience, fantastic phenomenon. But what I started to really appreciate was how restorative it was to spend waking time in the dark. Because it's really rare to walk around in the dark without a flashlight, without looking at a cell phone light. So it was a unique experience, and I started to appreciate that. Well, at the same time, I learned that light pollution disrupts pretty much every part of a firefly's life cycle. And so when you see fireflies rising in your yard or in a field, wherever you tend to come across fireflies, you're witnessing the last stage of their life, but they have been living and glowing in the area for up to 2 years before you see them rise, glowing under and on the ground, like little seeds of light, just waiting for the moment to rise, which I found to be extraordinary. Also, when you see fireflies, I could really talk about fireflies forever. But so when you see fireflies, there's usually more than one species there. And every firefly species has a unique pattern, like fingerprints. So one of the most common, the Big Dipper, you can see they make little strokes of light. So it's like a Morse code. So when you're in a field or in a yard and you're seeing fireflies, there are actually multiple species there, and there are resources that you can figure out what you have. Come talk to me later, we'll get into that. But so I started to think also just about how important it is to consider that darkness has things to offer. Darkness has important things to share, because we think of darkness as ignorance, light as knowledge, but darkness has its own wisdom. And fireflies really helped me see that. And after this piece ran in the Washington Post, I had people reaching out to me from Kansas and Iowa and all these different places. And they were like, read that story, loved it. It inspired me to turn out my porch lights more often. And that blew my mind, right? I'd written a story that inspired someone to actually physically turn a light off in a way that bettered their environment and the wildlife around them and their own health. It was extraordinary. But I don't think they did it because I talked about how light pollution, contributes to certain cancers, mood disorders. The list goes on and on. I think they did it because they got curious. And so I got curious and I started thinking, if I learned so much from fireflies, what could I learn from salamanders and bats and all of these other creatures that depend on darkness? And so I set out on this larger quest to think of darkness as habitat, which is what it is, and it's habitat that we're losing, and it's crucial to life. And I love the Wildways. The Wildways Project's so important, because when we preserve these areas, we're not only preserving the daylit world, we're preserving the nighttime world, natural darkness, which is crucial, and natural darkness is also important as a corridor for these animals to travel. So I actually set out next to search for salamanders. So I had always known that somewhere in the vicinity there was a spotted salamander migration. So you all have spotted salamander migrations happening around you too. And so basically spotted salamanders live underground all their lives, except basically 3 weeks a year. And also, we don't really know what they're doing the rest of the time. They're underground and we don't know a lot about their lives, but they emerge for 3 weeks. They make a pilgrimage to these places called ephemeral pools or vernal pools, which maybe some of you are familiar with since you are familiar with the fantastic work that this organization does. I was new to this. I was new to ephemeral pools, and I just like calling them ephemeral pools. Like vernal pools, okay, but ephemeral. I just love it. Because, most of the time they're just not there, which is another real challenge, right? We have something that we're trying to take care of, but we don't even know it's there. Because most of the year, it's just an indention. It's just an indention where rainwater and snowmelt gathers and creates these pools where fish don't have a chance to establish populations, so it makes it a really safe place for different species to come and procreate, and they do. You can have a vernal pool that's the size of this stage, and it will have more life concentrated in that area than for acres and acres around during the spring migration time. So I followed the spotted salamanders. This is a photograph of the salamanders' eggs, and these eggs actually photosynthesize. They have algae in them, and scientists only recently discovered that not only do these eggs have algae in them, which actually helps provide oxygen, these salamanders actually have algae in their cells. This is a pretty recent discovery. So these are vertebrates that photosynthesize, and they spend most of their lives in the dark. It's wild. So common species, they didn't know that this existed. They didn't know that these salamanders had algae in their cells. So this was a shocker, and it's like, well, if they have algae in their cells, what else don't we know? What other common species might have this? Spring peepers, all these different species concentrate here. And if you hear spring peepers, you're probably listening to an ephemeral pool. And if you are trying to find them, follow the sound of the frogs. And there are some places that are trying to map out ephemeral pools because we just don't know a lot about where they are because they are ephemeral and they're only temporary. But one of my favorite discoveries in these pools were fairy shrimp. That's really what people call them, fairy shrimp. And they really do kind of look like little fairies. But have any of you ever heard of sea monkeys? Okay, I always wanted some sea monkeys. I read every Archie comic book that came out between, the ages of 8 and 12. I was into the Archies. And Archie's always had the ads, and it's like, send a check or money order. And I was 10 and I didn't have a check or money order, and so I never got the sea monkeys. Only to find out in the process of researching this book, I had been surrounded by sea monkeys' cousins for my entire life. So fairy shrimp that live in these pools, they actually dehydrate. And in the spring, just like when you get the sea monkeys and you pour them in the water, that's happening all over the place. So I was surrounded by these amazing creatures, and I had no idea, which is something that kind of came up over and over again in the process of working on the book. But sea monkeys, they're all surrounding buffalo, I'm telling you. Yeah. So next I thought, okay, what would a book about nocturnal creatures be without owls? So I decided that I was going to find a way to have a meaningful encounter with the saw-whet owl, which you guys have saw-whet owls. They're incredibly small, very charismatic owls. They actually usually don't travel as far south as where I am in North Carolina, but I live in Southern Appalachian region where we have what are called sky islands. So these are high elevation habitats, remnants of boreal forests that have been left because of the elevation. So they do exist there sometimes. But in the end, I ended up spending a lot of time with a family of screech owls. So I went out in search of saw-whet owls, thinking I was going to have this experience with these hard-to-find owls, and I ended up getting a call from a friend of mine who was like, Leigh Ann, I know you're looking for some owls, and we just have some screech owls that they just are nesting in our tree. And I was able to actually spend time. It's really special. Birders among you probably know, like if somebody tells you where an owl's nest is, that's a big trust. That's like a big deal. So it's very exciting to be trusted with that information. I spent a lot of time with them. But what was really interesting about that experience is that, I was going to go to the Sky Islands in the high elevation boreal forest, and I ended up in a neighborhood in a forest land of about 3 trees separating a couple of houses. And it was just a reminder of how important a single tree can be, how important a cluster of 3 trees can be. And so the reason that this owl had ended up living in my friend's yard is because just down the street, they have a neighbor who just happens to be an astronomer. The section of the chapter is called The Owl and the Astronomer, and it's fantastic. But so this astronomer is also a birder, and so he had spent a lot of time building a house, but hoping that these owls would come and nest and live with him so that he could observe them. And so one night he went out, and his job at the observatory requires him to see like how cloudy it is. Sometimes he just goes out into his yard to see, should I remote send out these telescopes down the mountain to look at the stars? So we went out one night, and he was just super upset to discover that a broken street light on his road had been fixed. So the bulb had been replaced, and where there had been darkness, there was light. And he had actually seen these owls checking out his owl box, because screech owls, they house hunt. So he'd seen them checking out his owl box. He was pretty excited that they were going to come live with him. But when that light went on, the owls fled. And that's how they ended up in the tree in my neighbor's backyard, where they're in the shadow of a house. So again, how important a single tree can be. And they did get this light turned off. So how important a dark neighborhood can be. How important a dark city can be. Sometimes people talk about all you have to do is light the candle next to you, right? That's like how we illuminate. That's how we create hope. But I am here to say we can also snuff out the candle next to us and create more darkness. So in this book, I tried not to talk so much about what light pollution takes away, but about what darkness offers. Because I don't think we have a lot of dark, positive stories. And when I say I'm here to tell you a dark story, I mean an unbelievably fantastic and wondrous story. So darkness is beautiful, darkness is important, not only for owls, but also for songbirds. If you appreciate birds, if you appreciate the songbirds that come this spring, you are witnessing something that has been brought to you by darkness. The vast majority of songbirds migrate at night, and they need darkness as that corridor to travel. So it's incredibly important. And I chose to focus on my neighborhood, on my home region of Southern Appalachia, because it's the region that I know best. And I thought that I knew it pretty well. But as it turns out, I only knew half of it. I only knew the daylit half. And so if you haven't set out to know the landscapes that you love and know best at night, then you guys have a lot of exciting things waiting for you, I promise. Because at sunset, no matter where you are, any door you walk through is a portal to wonder. So, fantastic example of why I've come to believe that you will find wonders. Glowworms. So the glowworms in the book title, so adventures among, glowworms, moon gardens, other marvels of the dark. There are a lot of different things that people call glowworms, including those little seeds of light, firefly larvae. Some people call those glowworms. There are some people call railroad worms, which is like beetle larvae, which you have all around you. Some people call those glowworms. They're known as railroad worms because the patterns on their backs look like lit windows of a passenger train. But the glowworms that I write about in the book are a fungus gnat species. They look like stars. They're neon blue stars just scattered along forest floor. In New Zealand, you can go and see glowworms that are in caves, just, walls, ceilings, everything is just like, it's like walking through a celestial landscape, right? You walk trails at night scattered on the forest floor. So, these glowworms I've always wanted to go see. Anybody heard of the New Zealand glowworms? Like, millions of people go to New Zealand to see these glowworms every year. So when I was researching this book, I discovered that my home region is one of the only other places on Earth that neon blue glowworms are known to exist. And I not only found them at a tourist attraction where they were only discovered a few years ago in one of the largest concentrations that exists, I found them in my own neighborhood on a roadside embankment that I've driven by with my headlights on for years. 20 years, just driving by, but I'd never walked that road with my night vision looking for glowworms. So, and also here I would like to say, as someone who really, advocates for nocturnal wildlife, a lot of times I feel like I'm like a PR agent for moths and bats and glowworms, because glowworms are otherwise known as maggots. Yes, maggots are magical. Yes, that is my job but come on, it's believable, right? So these are Orpheolophotonae, and they have been found as far north as Pennsylvania. And I feel pretty confident in saying that there are some in New York State. So we don't know where they are. Synchronous fireflies, people think they were extremely rare. A lot of these species, it's not so much that they're incredibly rare, it's just that we are not looking for them. So, magical maggots, they're closer than you think. So, moths. What would a book about nocturnal creatures be without moths? So here I really do go into PR mode, because moths are they're the unsung heroes of the natural world. You love birds? Birds depend on caterpillars. All my life, I've thought when I see a caterpillar, oh look, it's a butterfly in waiting. But almost always, statistically, it is a moth in waiting. So birds depend on them. The verdant landscapes we appreciate in daylight, made possible by moths. There are some scientists who believe that globally, moths are more important pollinators than bees. I know, don't fight me on it, I'm just saying, like, they're really important pollinators, and they do not get the love that they deserve. So moths are incredibly diverse. They're tiny, tiny micro moths, like metallic as a disco ball. These moths, so Luna, Cecropia, these are some of the most beautiful, favorite moths. The size of my hands put together, that's not an exaggeration. That's how large they are. And they're all around us. So how do you have a meaningful, responsible encounter with moths? I wasn't sure. I realized over time that not only did I need guides to help me figure out how to have responsible encounters with this wildlife, I also needed to reacquaint with darkness. Like, I needed to kind of get comfortable with the dark. But so in order to learn more about moths, I decided to go to Mothapalooza, which is a festival that is held in Ohio. It is just as much fun as it sounds. They sell t-shirts that say, "Crazy Moth Lady." And I have totally turned into one. Yes, Mothapalooza is a blast. They have a waiting list now. I'm also a PR agent for Mothapalooza. But you can create a mothing station, which is what they call the observation stations. You can do it on your own. And by the way, so, birding, if you love birding, you're a birder. If you love mothing, you're a mother. There's a whole subculture there. So you can, choose different light sources, put up a sheet, and see what comes to land on that sheet and what will stream out of darkness. And this is important because all of our stories generally tell us that darkness is a void. Darkness is death. So why would we worry about losing it, right? But when you see all of a sudden all this biodiversity, this gorgeous life just streaming out of the dark into the light, it is a really transformative experience, because all of a sudden you can experience tangibly that the darkness is habitat, that the darkness holds this cornucopia of life, and it's fantastic. Flips everything upside down. So, for me, a powerful moment in my mothing journey as a crazy moth lady was learning about the woolly worm, which you guys, I believe, know as the woolly bear. Familiar with woolly bears? Okay. In my hometown, 2 counties over, we actually have a festival. It is the Woolly Worm Festival. 20,000 people annually come to this festival to celebrate the woolly bear, which is arguably the most famous caterpillar in the United States. And it wasn't until I was working on this book that I realized I had been surrounded by woolly bears my entire life. There is a woolly bear festival that I've known about my entire life, but never in my life had I considered, what does the woolly worm become? And I'm not the only one. I mean, writing this book, I had so many times where I was like, can't even wait for the book to be published. I'm texting everybody I know, did you know this? Did you know this? And a lot of people did not. But the woolly worm, the woolly bear, becomes an Isabella tiger moth. And I'd never met an Isabella tiger until I was working on this book, and I set out to try to meet one with a mothing station in my own yard. So if you have been surrounded by woolly bears your entire life, you have also been surrounded by tigers. Okay, if there was one nocturnal creature that made me a little bit nervous in my journey, bats. So bats really need some seriously positive PR. And I will admit, they made me nervous. I set out, I was like, okay, I feel like I'm kind of like bat neutral, and I'm trying to be bat positive. How am I going to do this? So I went to a fantastic festival called Bat Blitz. So I went to Bat Blitz with bat enthusiasts and bat biologists, and that is how I had some meaningful encounters with bats. We will not get into the story of how I ended up having a bat as a roommate, but that's in the book if you want to learn a little more about that story. But I did learn a lot about bats, and I did come around to being bat positive. But the one thing I really carry with me from my experience at Bat Blitz, which, by the way, is so exhausting. I don't know how bat biologists do it, but I mean, I have never met a group of people who are just like, in ravines, like crawling out of ravines at like 4 o'clock in the morning, and then just being like, hey, you want to go get a beer? Just like, what? No. So Miss Vicky at the Bat Blitz is a bat educator. She goes to schools. She's pretty well known as the Bat Lady. So one of the things that Vicky said to me is what I carry with me from Bat Blitz. And she says, she spends a lot of time trying to get people to be bat positive. She spends a lot of time combating fear of bats. And so she said to me, if you fear something, it means you probably have something to learn from it. And that goes for bats, that goes for the dark, that goes for a lot of things in life. But so bats taught me a lot of things, but the Bat Lady taught me a lot in that regard. So one of the more challenging things that I set out to find when I was on this quest to appreciate natural darkness in an age of artificial light was foxfire. So who's familiar with the Foxfire books? Okay, so this is a book series, sold millions of copies, came out in the 70s, still printed today. It's the codification of a lot of Southern Appalachian traditions. My mom has an original set from the 1970s that has been in our house for all of my life. I'm familiar with the book series, but it wasn't until an adult that I knew that foxfire, the name, came from a term for bioluminescent fungi. And it wasn't until I was writing this book until I learned that foxfire is not a species of glowing mushroom. It's not a species of fungi. It's an umbrella term for a myriad of glowing mushrooms, a myriad of species, which I have an abundance in my home region, and you have an abundance of here in this region. So I set out to find some foxfire, and I wasn't sure how to do it because, again, I was looking for guides. How am I going to figure out how to identify these mushrooms? How am I going to wander around in the dark? And so I found a guide. His name's Tal Galton, and he's one of the few naturalists who leads night hikes focused on foxfire, on finding and identifying foxfire. So one of the first things that Tal teaches you when you set out is when you're walking in the dark, it's important to do a pronounced heel-toe, like literally teaching you how to walk in the dark so that it helps you not trip over tree roots or cracks in a sidewalk. So I want to share a little bit of that journey with you, just a little snippet of my experience with Tal. I asked Tal if he's seen a change in people after these walks, peculiar as they are. In the literal sense, I don't really see people at all, he says. This is to him one of the most interesting things about night walks. After greeting strangers in low light, he typically never sees them again, though they almost always go on to spend hours walking around together. Still, those unseen have a presence. He quickly learns the cadence of their voices, the character-revealing insights they share from the dark, which grants each attendee a shroud of privacy, even when enmeshed in a crowd. The most memorable transformations he's observed have taken place among teenagers. I've had kids terrified of the dark, I mean shaking with fear. And once they see bioluminescence, they become entranced, he says. They shed fear. It's like they altogether forget it's something they were carrying. In front of me, I sense a tumble. Root, he shouts. Root, I say, turning my head to amplify the alert. Root, 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 vocal cords ping. In Victorian times, people marked trees to guide them home. They dug braille-like pocks on trunks to help them feel their way along. It's an intimacy of place that Tal seems to have without causing tree damage, so acquainted he is with this landscape. I suppose in daylight, I have familiarity with my plot of land too. But tonight, the familiar wilds of these mountains have been made strange. We pause when we see a puddle of ethereal light beside the trail. It's surrounded by flecks of light that speckle the ground like paint splatter. Tal explains that it's mycelium in the process of consuming fallen leaves. If I turned a flashlight on, he says, this would just look like ordinary leaf litter. Tal picks up a handful of light and gives it to me. The leaves are cool and damp, well on their way to decay. I cannot see the teenager behind me, so I hold the glowing pile of mycelium up to announce it as an offering, inhaling wafts of the leaves' mild medicinal scent. She is the youngest of the group, and she stayed in her father's car until the minute we left the parking lot earlier, cell phone light pointed directly at her face. In the dark, I've heard her emit a few grunts, indicating that she'd rather be somewhere else, but in this moment, she comes across as wholly present. She seems to be carrying a fear of missing out on cell phone time, more than she's exhibiting a fear of the dark. But she sighs when she accepts the mycelium, as though she's traded something heavy for a puff of light. How beautiful, she whispers. We are, in essence, watching death become life. We are watching darkness being transformed into light. The teenager stares into the handful of alchemy before finally passing it on. Mycelium, she announces, letting the person behind her know what's coming, announcing wonder as she'd previously passed on warnings. Mycelium, mycelium, mycelium. Each handoff is announced, connecting us to each other. We are no longer faces. We are no longer hands. We are all part of the darkness. Because in this forest, the glow of this leaf litter is all that visibly exists. It moves through the night, tracing the path of our voices, like a luminescent cloud pushed by invisible winds. So, when I ask people, how long do you think it takes for your eyes to adjust? Typically they say 20 to 30 minutes, which is what I thought before I set out with Tal. But actually, we gain night vision incrementally for hours. So again, if you have never set out to ripen your night vision with not a glance at a cell phone away from all artificial lights in the darkest place that you can find, you might not know your own powers. So take that for what it is and consider where you could go with it. Very common foxfire that is in this area is also common in my area, and jack-o'-lantern mushrooms are they flourish here in fall, as do bitter oysters. So in this image, this is bitter oyster in daylight and bitter oyster in the dark. So it grows a dim neon green, and so this is very nondescript in daylight. Twigs all around have this growing on it, nondescript. At night, they are actual magic wands. So find one if you are interested. So moon gardens. I set out to experience night blooming flowers because we think of flowers as being associated with sunlit meadows, butterflies, but they're entire moonlit landscapes frequented by moths that are glorious. So I set out to find a tropical moonflower because I am not a great patient gardener, but I do have many friends who are. And so I was asking around, and so at one point, I get a message from my friend Amy, and she says, Leigh Ann, you need to come over because I've accidentally planted a moon garden. How do you accidentally plant a moon garden? Well, if you're Amy, you live in accordance with your historic home, which is one of the oldest homes in Watauga County, North Carolina. If you change a doorknob, you want it to be period appropriate. If you have livestock, you will get heirloom sheep that you shear yourself. Amy makes her own ketchup. And when she set out to plant a garden by her kitchen, she decided to read diaries. She decided to look into historical documents. What would the inhabitants of this house have planted? And what they would have planted was a moon garden, because this garden was planted pre-electricity, because the inhabitants of her house, this was pre-electricity, and they had planted this garden as their evening entertainment. And Amy had recreated this without knowing that she recreated this. She actually, when I told her about hummingbird moths, hawk moths, size of hummingbirds, amazing to watch, she actually stepped down into this garden, which she now realized was a moon garden, and she was almost in tears. And I was like, what is going on? And she's like, you told me to go look, and as soon as I went out there, I found one. So she had hawk moths visiting all of these night blooming flowers, and she had also planted lamb's ear, which is like velveteen, reflects moonlight. So there are all of these different kinds of plants that have been planted in this garden. Such a sensory delight. And while I was exploring all of these other species and all of these nocturnal landscapes, I actually learned a lot about myself too, which also applies to you guys. So not only is our sleep schedule on circadian rhythm, all kinds of our body functions are dependent on circadian rhythm, including our sense of smell. So at the exact time that night blooming flowers are releasing and blooming into darkness, our sense of smell is at its highest. So they put out a fragrance, and we are there to smell it, and it is fantastic. And I think a lot of times, back to the PR for the moths, because really represent. So when we see moths, we're often seeing a moth that is banging itself against a porch light. And it's erratic, and we're nervous. But when you watch a moth in its natural habitat, which is to say darkness, it's a really serene experience. So in addition to being able to watch these flowers bloom, which might sound a little like watching the grass grow, but I promise it's really a lovely experience. In the end, I never found a tropical moonflower, but what I found was common evening primrose, which also grows all around you here, sometimes in ditches. I realized that in daylight, nondescript, no color, bunch of weeds. At night, secret gardens. I had never gone looking for what happens at night, and what happens at night is that common even primrose have a latch, an actual latch that pops. And the bloom, like a time-lapse camera, very quickly unfurls and opens. And you can watch this. So Eudora Weldy, this famous Southern writer, she used to have night blooming flower parties. She'd have everybody over, let's have some mint juleps and watch the flowers bloom. Sounds pretty nice, actually. But common evening primrose, secret gardens, in ditches everywhere. They're really lovely. So after spending time with all of these species, I decided to look into the human relationship to darkness and the human relationship to light. And sometimes I don't even know how I come up with these things, but I decided that I would trace artificial light back to its beginnings and learn how to make fire, the original artificial light, with sticks in my bare hands. So I learned how to make fire with a bow drill to trace that back. And one of the first things that struck me was how very intimately our ancestors, who had very recently in human history a relationship to darkness, how they understood how much energy it takes, how much energy has to be expended for light. They understood that connection, whereas we don't have that connection anymore. But it takes a lot of work to make artificial light with your bare hands and sticks. And you also have to know the species around you, the plant species. You have to know which bark is gonna ignite. You have to be really familiar. So I also, in this journey, not only changed the way that I think about darkness, I changed the way that I think about light. So humans are very much disrupted by blue light. Our rhythms are very much disrupted by blue light. I think there's a growing awareness of this with the blue light glasses, right? People are becoming a little bit more aware of this. It's more disruptive for humans, it's more disruptive for wildlife. And so studies have shown not only is this a physiological experience, there's limited studies that shows that the types of light spectra that we're exposed to also changes the way that we communicate with each other. It changes the language that we use. A lot of people think that there's reason to believe that darkness played a large role in the development of human culture and human religion. They've done studies where if you put people in a fluorescent lit room as opposed to a room with candlelight or around a campfire, that people tend to use really practical language, like their grievances are aired in the blue light, and when they're exposed to warm tone spectra, there's more storytelling language that is like ancestral stories are passed down. It actually affects the way that we communicate with each other. So if you've ever, thought, man, the conversations that I'm having in this fluorescent boardroom versus the conversations that I tend to have around a fire are very different conversations, might not be a coincidence. So there is a little bit of, of research to back that up. So in the beginning of my journey, I started learning about light pollution, and I started closing curtains because I was like, oh no, I don't want the light to disrupt the fireflies. It took the entire journey for me to recognize that when I was doing that, I was still wrapping that light around myself. So it took the entire journey for me to understand that I needed to change my relationship to light. So we marvel over fireflies because they are one of the only species that make light inside of their bodies. But we as humans are the only species on this planet that have the ability to make light outside of ours. We are a light-making species, and we are making so much light now that it is disrupting every living being on Earth. So we're the light-making species, but we can also, back to the snuff the candle out we can snuff the lights out and we can reclaim darkness as a place that we also belong, as part of our habitat, which is a long process. But I actually have changed the way that I use lights in my house, not just outside of my house. When the lights outside, when the sun sets, when they turn red and amber, the lights in my house also turn red and amber. I have specific lamps that I use. My son says that it makes our house look like a haunted house, but I say it is the human body can still create melatonin naturally with red light much more easily than when exposed to blue light. So this is, don't have to take a melatonin pill. We'll handle it, just switch the lights out. But so dark positive conversations, dark positive stories are so needed and so important. My great dream for the book is that it will inspire readers to take their own journey, because this is my story of exploring the other half of my home landscape. But no matter where you are, truly, night has things to offer. Night has experiences and wonders that are just waiting for you, and you do not have to go far to find them. You just have to find the darkest places that you can and kind of be a little bit creative in the way that you do that. But I hope that you will find this story useful in that way, and I would love to hear from you all, questions, thoughts, comments. I would love to just talk with you.